Hi, this is Steve Delamarter, along with my friend, colleague, Dr. Ralph Lee. We'd like to speak for a bit here about the new readings of the 17th century that occur in the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament. The general question that stands over our work is, what are the mechanisms that account for variation in the tradition? And we have big forces at work and smaller forces at work. Probably the biggest one you see, the digital fingerprint for it, is these two manuscripts sitting off in the book of Hosea, standing at 45% different from all the rest. What can account? A huge difference must have a huge force to explain it. And in this case, it becomes real easy when you look into it. And we discovered that there is a version, these two manuscripts are translated from the Latin Vorlage of the Ethiopic Old Testament, and consequently have a very different text form. Well, in a smaller way, this fork in the road is also explained by text forms. There is a new text form that arises. This is the old text form right here, the 14th to the 16th century, and through forces that we're going to explain here in a little bit, a new text form arises out of the 17th century and is passed on after that. So we want to understand that big difference. But also then, even after we explain that big difference, we still have all these small variations of all the manuscripts, even within the old manuscripts and the younger text form, ETH1 and ETH2. What are the mechanisms that account for differentiation within these? And we think we can account for them now in these two primary mechanisms we've been talking about. The first one is the minority variants of the 14th to the 16th century and what happens to them in the 17th to the 21st century. And then we dealt with this in a previous video, but we'll just explain it real quickly here. And then finally, the new readings of the 17th century, which is the focus of this video. Ralph, take us back and explain a little bit more about this minority variants.
Thank you, Steve. So again, just revisiting, by definition, a minority variant is present in a minority of the manuscripts in the EA period. So here, the dots represent less than half of the manuscripts showing a given reading. And what's of interest here is what happens to those. And we can see from the dots on the right-hand side that in some cases, the whole of the East True Tradition decides to pick up that minority variant. In other cases, maybe only a couple of those manuscripts may choose to do that. And in some cases, there's a sort of bit of ambivalence. It's sort of half-half. And their adoption explains at least part of the trend or the differentiation between the manuscripts of the early period and the late period.
And that's particularly the case, isn't it, when you have this uniform cluster behavior of one group of manuscripts in the early period, that these are the primary things that will drive them, give them the profile of a cluster. Yeah.
Yes.
So now we move to a final mechanism that explains a huge amount of the rest of the story. The digital fingerprint of the new readings of the 17th century are fairly easy to see. Ralph, walk us through what you see in Amos here.
Yeah. So in contrast to the minority variants, in these cases, there are no witnesses at all in the older manuscripts of the EA period. All of these, the dots in this diagram, represent readings that are only found from the 17th century onwards. The differentiation between the clusters of ETH2 is partly a manifestation of the different degree to which those new readings are adopted. And as we saw with the minority variants, we can see some cases where they're adopted across the board. And we see other cases where only one cluster or a couple of clusters adopt those readings.
This, in the book of Amos, the visual distinction between these is very, very bright and clear. The visual distinction will get a little less clear as we look at some other examples. Here, for instance, is Ecclesiastes, which EA1 and EA2, the earliest attested text, those two clusters, show that clean. None of these manuscripts of the 14th to the 16th century, and indeed not a single manuscript of the 14th to the 16th century that appear that carry the primary text form of ETH1 have these new readings of the 17th century in them. Here's the manuscripts that are produced with this ETH2 text form over here. We have then this little group that makes the visual thing sort of cluttered a little bit. These are late copies of the earliest attested text form. So these are the first allegiance of these scribes was to produce the old text form. Nevertheless, they make concessions to what's going on around them, these new readings, and there's backward influence, so to speak, from the new text form into the old text form, because these scribes are doing their work in the 17th century or later. With the exception of this one manuscript, which is a 15th century manuscript. However, what I said earlier is true. It has none of these readings from the 17th century, so we can say with confidence, at least in the sample we have, 30 to 40 manuscripts, these are new readings of the 17th century. All of these are the mechanisms that account for the differentiation between the clusters within ETH1 on the one hand and ETH2 on the other hand. One more example here, Ralph, take us through the Judges material.
Yeah, so Judges again looks different. First of all, the late copies here marked in blue are scattered across the EA clusters, which isn't always the case. They tend to often be clustered or grouped together in the EA 3, 4, and 5. But nevertheless, each of these blue ones represents that same phenomenon of a manuscript which has mostly the EA1 or ETH1 text form, but is copied after the 17th century. And again, these show minority readings or innovations that are mostly, in this case, adopted in the ETH2 period, in the period after the 17th century. Notable in this case is that we have a single large cluster in the 17th century or ETH2 period, and the widespread adoption of these readings in the manuscripts of the ETH2 period is the reason why there isn't a set of clusters. There's no mechanism pulling apart clusters in the ETH2 period.
Yeah, one interesting thing about this particular data set in Judges is that in Judges, when they all go together. In the 17th century, there's very little one-offs in the thing, but we do have these interesting phenomena of other readings shared by late manuscripts that don't appear in early manuscripts, but also don't appear in these. So that's a very small mechanism that's going on, but it's of interest to us. What then does all this teach us about the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament? And we could talk for at least an hour about this stuff, but we'll try not to do that. The largest engine of differentiation is the difference between the two text forms, okay? That's the main, or in the case of Book of Amos, we had actually three text forms. We had the Lat V text, 45% different than everything in the traditional Ethiopic text. Then within the Ethiopic text, ETH1, ETH2, those two text forms are the biggest differentiation between, it's the largest mechanism working to create differentiation between the ETH1 and the ETH2.
Two phenomenon that, if you like, produce the most of the differences in the ETH2 period. The next most significant are these new readings that have not been seen in the ETH1 period that are introduced. by whatever mechanism and give us the majority of the readings of our new text form.
Yeah, and they will add, won't they, to the differences, the fundamental differences in the text forms. Then this adds to because these are just new, unique to ETH2, right?
Right.
And so they're adding to that difference. Yeah. A third thing that this teaches about the textual history is it shows us the degree to which the clusters of the 17th century participate in the new readings. The degree to which they do that determines the difference between the clusters in the ETH2 period. They are what define the primary mechanism that defines the difference between the clusters in the ETH2 period.
The next most significant thing relates to the decisions made in the 17th century about which of the minority variants from the past will be eliminated from the tradition. So when we see these minority variants and we look at those diagrams with all the dots on, we see in many examples minority variants that appear and then are never seen again. They're innovations that, for whatever reason, are rejected by the later tradition. But in other cases, we see innovations that are present in maybe only one or two manuscripts of the ETH1 period that then become widely adopted in the ETH2 period. And again, this is another thing that drives the differentiation of the ETH2 text form.
Yeah. Yep. The late copies of earliest attested text forms represent a real interesting subset of the manuscripts that show two sets of forces at work: a primary commitment, an ongoing commitment to the old text form. That's the main thing that characterized these late copies. They're not going along with the standardized modern Textus Receptus. They're still in allegiance to the old text form. Nevertheless, they have to make concessions at various places along the way to the new readings of the 17th century that are going on around them in their time frame. But it remains remarkable that even after the modern Textus Receptus is established, they're nevertheless, they show that there's a subset that are retaining allegiance to the old text form, nevertheless having to make concessions with readings here and there.
All of these things put us in a position really to describe in some detail the editorial approach of the period of standardization, and it explains to us, going back to that first diagram or the early diagram with all the arrows on, showing the minor levels of differentiation between manuscripts and then between clusters. These are the primary things that explain all of those details for us.
And so we can say that the agenda of the standardized text has to do primarily with decisions about minority variants from the past and whether to exclude them or not. And secondarily, places where they decide, nope, nothing in the past is adequate for what needs to be here. We're doing something brand new. These two decisions represent the primary mechanisms that are the agenda of the editorial approach to the epoch of standardization, which then we would have to also call an epoch of innovation in the tradition. But it also reveals something about the editorial approach of the modern Textus Receptus. At one point, we thought that the modern Textus Receptus had an innovative character in relationship to the past. But as we got closer into the data clearly shows that the modern Textus Receptus aligns itself first and foremost with the decisions of the 17th century and goes along with it. Very rarely does it do something completely new. Instead, it's going along with the decisions that have already been made. Anything else to say about that, Ralph, or we can go on to the next point?
I think you've covered it well, Steve. Thank you. We have a footnote to make, I suppose, don't we? That one further phenomenon, which is that of scribal idiosyncrasy, does explain some of the differentiation between manuscripts. But we mentioned this last because it's actually the least significant. We can show in some cases there are scribes that seem to be significant outliers in the tradition, but most of the time scribes follow each other's trends and follow the patterns that we've been discussing already.
And maybe I could jump in to just say at this point that we learn that the textual history is a social process that's dominated by social activities, namely individuals operating in relationship with other individuals or with the larger community. And usually that leads to a tremendous uniformity. It's a traditional culture, book culture, that is primarily working to retain, and across its entirety of its tradition, it's 85% uniform. But it's that final 15% that are remarkable and show us about. And then, yes, this end piece that there are manuscripts like Cambridge Additional 1570 that is remarkable for its idiosyncrasy. It's just doing time and again something that's slightly different than everybody else. And that has made in the history of scholarship this odd circumstance where one of the most available, one of the most complete manuscripts of and one of the oldest manuscripts of the Ethiopic Old Testament has been used in so much scholarly work, and nevertheless it is marked first and foremost by its own individual idiosyncrasy. And I might I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and switch us over to look at this report in Tableau, this visualization. When we look at plot out the story of scribal idiosyncrasy in 22 books of the Ethiopic Old Testament, here's what we get. This visualization is based on well over 1 million data points. And the level of difference, so this is 0 here, this is 5% difference. This is 10% difference, 15%, 20%, 25% different. So down here, you can see we can make the statement that far and away the majority of scribal activity reaches to the final 2.5%. It's 97, 98% completely uniform across the tradition. And you can see all of this idiosyncratic activity takes place in a very small percentage. These ones out here, these outliers, are UNESCO 1034, one of our Lat V Forlaga manuscripts. Again, the same thing here. That's what accounts for these big differences. This is the interesting idiosyncratic work of one scholar in the 20th century, but the rest just bears witness to this. There's always idiosyncrasy going on, but nevertheless, it represents a very small percentage of scribal activity. Most of scribal activity is committed to. Anything else to say about this one, Ralph?
No, I think that covers it nicely. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, well, that brings to a close then this introduction to the new readings of the 17th century.